Mr. Speaker, the chair of the committee has just resumed her speech. Is a master of overstatement. She said, this is a bill that does, quote-unquote, just a bit to help tackling the gang problem in New Zealand. I regret to say, Mr. Speaker, that just a bit is a gross exaggeration. This bill does precisely nothing. Nothing, Mr. Speaker, nothing. And that's why Todd McClay, the mover of the bill, 2 minutes into his speech had to go off and talk about something else, and Jackie Dean couldn't last the distance. Couldn't last the distance because they know in their hearts, Mr. Speaker, that this is there's a BS bill. A BS bill that will do nothing to protect New Zealanders and nothing to damage the gang culture in this country. I asked the officials at the Select Committee a very simple question. I said, is there anything in this bill that the government departments and schools can't already do? And, Mr. Speaker, do you know what the answer to that was? No. There was nothing, according to officials, in this bill that ministers can't do already. I say to Jackie Dean that if there's a problem with patched gang members going into schools and government departments now, every minister in this House has the power, has the ability to issue an instruction that no patched member will be allowed on school grounds or in government premises. That is a fact right now. So once again, Mr. Speaker, we will spend an hour of parliamentary time debating a piece of legislation that does precisely nothing. Precisely nothing. And that was the answer, Mark Mitchell, that the officials gave on the committee. I put the question this way. I said that if a gang member goes into a government department, can you remove that person, refuse to serve them, get rid of them? Yes. I said, what about if the gang member is loitering around the entrance to the school or the government department? What can you do about it? And they said, we can't do anything. I said, is there anything in this legislation that deals with that situation? And they said no. So here we've got the irony. You've already got the power to do what this bill says they will do within the government offices. There is no power to deal with the gang member loitering outside, and this bill does absolutely nothing to deal with that problem. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, and put it absolutely and clearly on record, that I used the word in the Minority Report, I have no truck with a gang culture that encourages its members, promotes or facilitates or even tolerates them committing crime. And too many of our gangs in this country are organisations put together for the purpose of committing crime. But what I want in regard to the organised crime that gangs are involved in is not phony legislation like this, phony legislation that does nothing. I want real legislation that actually makes an impact on those gangs and their criminal behaviour. And I stand in this House, Mr McKelvey, very proudly to say that I introduced, as Minister of Justice, a bill called the Proceeds of Crime Bill. You know what that bill does, Mr McKelvey? It enables the courts to go in and to strip the assets, every asset that the gang controls or owns, if they cannot prove that those assets were other than the proceeds of criminal activity. That made a real difference. Let me read what the newspaper said about it at the time. Within 2 months of this coming in, the police had seized $7.4 million worth of criminal assets from the gang. A year later, even the now National Minister of Justice and then Police was fighting about legislation that wasn't her legislation, but was my legislation and Annette King's legislation. She bragged that among the assets seized were cash and bank accounts worth $13.5 million, 38 residential and commercial properties worth $15.5 million, 9 lifestyle blocks and farms worth $8.4 million, and vehicles worth $600,000. That is the result of legislation that I introduced after going to the United Kingdom and seeing how effective their proceeds of crime legislation were. That is real legislation. That hurt the gangs where they could least tolerate the pain. They lost the proceeds of their criminal activity. They didn't have the resources to promote their criminal organisations. That's real legislation, not phony legislation like this, Mr Macleay. You knew when you brought this legislation into the House that this bill does precisely nothing. It does nothing that ministers and departments and schools are not already empowered to do. And that's a disgrace, because if we waste our time on phony solutions, we're not spending our time on finding real solutions to real problems like organised criminal activity through gangs. Mr Speaker, the other thing about gangs that are of concern to me is that gangs, by their appearance and by their behaviour, and particularly their behaviour, can be intimidating. And there's nobody in this House that has anything other than zero tolerance for intimidatory criminal behaviour. But we have legislation on the books already that deals with intimidatory behaviour. It's called the Summary Offences Act. And Mark Mitchell will know this. I think when he was with the police, he would be familiar with the section. Section 3 makes threatening behaviour imprisonable, as it should be. Section 21 makes intimidation imprisonable. And what I say to this government is don't worry about the superficial, don't put in statute laws that already exist, but do something to enforce the legislation you already have on the statute books. There should be no tolerance of intimidatory behaviour. The laws are in place. Enforce the laws. But I heard the National Party bragging about police numbers before. I'll let the National Party know that Annette King, as Minister of Police, added 1,000 additional police officers to our police force. That included 240 of the 600 that the National Party is claiming now. But the worst thing is that news on Radio New Zealand yesterday, drawn to the attention of the House by Chris Farfoy. We have, in the last year, seen a drop in frontline officers of 213 frontline police officers. We want to deal with organised crime. You don't deal with it by cutting the number of frontline officers. And that's precisely what that National Party, complete with its former policemen, have actually allowed to happen. And I'll let the member, Mr Sabin, know that we had promises at the Select Committee last year there'd be no closure of police stations. What about Blockhouse Bay? What about Point Chev? What about downtown Auckland? What about the range of police bases that this national government has closed? They come to the House with phony legislation that does nothing, while they cut the police numbers and they close the police stations. It's worse than that, Mr Speaker. There are huge anomalies in this legislation. You know, under this legislation, I can put on a greasy jacket with a swastika on and walk into a school ground and nothing in this legislation touches me. Nothing. I can wear a swastika, the most offensive, the most intimidating symbol that there is, into a school ground, and nothing in this legislation prevents me doing that. If I put on a headhunter's patch, I'm covered by the legislation, but if I wear the swastika, that's okay. If this legislation was really about intimidation and offensive behaviour, why wouldn't you cover a symbol like the swastika? Now, let's have another look at how this legislation is going to be enforced. You know, I can wear my patch at a bus stop unless there's a shelter there. If there's a shelter, the police can come and arrest me, but if there's a bus stop without a shelter, they can't. I can walk into a swimming pool with my patch on and I'll be arrested, but I can walk onto the sports field and they can't touch me. I can walk down the footpath, and if it's covered, I might be breaking this law, and it's not covered, I'm not breaking it. You know, even Mr Macleay had to come in to the Select Committee to find out what was in and what wasn't in his bill. This legislation does not meet the basic requirements of good legislation, being clear and being consistent. Mr Speaker, I can go in, my last point, if I've got mongrel mob tattooed all over my face, I'm not breaking this legislation, but if it's in fine print on my jacket, I am. This bill does nothing. It's a nonsense. It's rubbish, and that's why we're opposing it. Do something real about the gangs. Stop pretending.